Why does revenue still feel fragile even when the demand is there? Why do forecasts look great on paper right up until they don't? And why do so many leadership teams feel like they're doing all the right things in RevOps, yet growth still feels harder to manage than it used to? We're talking about something new, RevOps for clients. It's an integral step of the commercial management system. Because when RevOps stops at the point of sale, leaders are left managing revenue with blind spots. And those blind spots show up later as renewal surprises, margin pressure, and missed growth opportunities. Hi, I'm Courtney Baker, and this is AI Know-How from DeWolf, helping you reimagine your business in the AI era. As always, I'm joined by DeWolf CEO DeWolf, Chief Product and Technology Officer Mohan Rao, and Nordlight CEO Pete Buer. We also have a guest interview with Dr. Vasant Dhar on his brilliant new book, Thinking with Machines. And we're airing the first part of this week's show. It's a fascinating conversation about the intersection of humans and machines and the new world of work that's, quite frankly, already here. But first, Pete Buer joins us to break down some of the latest AI news impacting business leaders. Hey, Pete, how are you?
I'm good, Courtney. How are you?
I'm doing great. Pete, we've got new data from the Conference Board's C-Suite Outlook survey, and it looks like the experimentation phase is officially over. Executives are now saying the number one AI priority for 2026 is measuring ROI. No surprise there. What's the takeaway, Pete?
Well, this is a good one for the data junkies, so let's dig in and get dirty. Conference Board surveyed over 1,700 executives, including more than 750 CEOs, and the results show a pretty clear moment of migration as relates to AI from experimenting to expectations regarding results. Few highlights from the data. 43% of executives named AI and technology as an investment priority for 2026, which is a pretty strong showing given the alternative choices were things like product innovation and improving customer experience. But AI and technology scored highest. 41% of executives then say measuring the ROI of AI is their number one priority within the AI planning choices for 2026. And that is ahead of things like enhancing the expertise of the team regarding AI or changing culture, driving change management as relates to AI. Measuring ROI is the number one choice. Not surprisingly, given our markets, the number jumps to 48% in North America. We score highest globally across all regions regarding the importance of measuring ROI on AI. The stat I liked best, though, was the difference between executives and their boards compared to those numbers that we just saw, the 40 to 50% range for executives, depending on whether it's the overall sample or the US. 98% of board members identified measuring the ROI of AI investments as a top priority. I don't know what the other 2% were thinking about, but 98% is pretty impressive. There are some other interesting differences between how different CXOs on the team saw the priority. Let people grab the report and read into to find all the nuances. But I think where we've landed here is sort of the big space for takeaways. First, measuring and demonstrating ROI on AI investments is no longer optional. And second, there's a serious expectation gap between the board and the executive team, and presumably it gets worse the farther down into the organization that you go regarding the importance of this priority. The one person who sits at the center of it all, the CEO, I think has a big job to be done across 2026 to get everybody on the same page.
Totally agree. I am curious, Pete, do you see any concern with a seemingly
overabundance of emphasis on ROI, or do you think this is just natural progression of the adoption of AI?
I think businesses make decisions informed by data, and the best businesses have the best data and use it most actively. And why on earth wouldn't you be trying to bring some kind of a return lens to AI? There are a lot of levers that AI pulls. It's not just as simple as expense; it's revenue creation, it's organizational change management, and so your ability to get to clarity or a definitive number on ROI is tough, but you should be doing everything in your power with this incredibly powerful technology to understand what its possibilities are, at least so that you can make good decisions internally as an organization, as a leadership team. But then, of course, out of a, a duty of care in reporting to investors and using capital wisely.
Yeah. Yeah, I expect this number will continue to grow next year. It'll be really interesting to see it a year from now. Pete, thank you as always.
Maybe we'll get those last 2%
Yeah.
board members to
Yeah, I
weigh
wonder.
in the other direction. Thanks, Courtney. Love it.
Revenue is the lifeblood of any business. Well, that or profit. But without those, there is no business. So I was excited to sit down with David and Mohan recently for the first episode in our series on RevOps for clients to get their thoughts on why commercial operations is so important and why far too many companies sell themselves short by thinking the work is done when a new contract is signed. David, Mohan, you two, little story, going back in time. Do you remember back in the day, you probably were in one of these companies and the
Is she
salespeople.
calling us old?
Okay,
Apparently.
before the
Back in the
podcast
day, you were
started,
probably in here.
you two were talking about keyboarding classes, okay? So everybody listening, let the record state you determine people's age on this podcast. But I think you can tell from my voice that I'm the youngest of the. No, I'm just- okay, back in the day, I think you two probably were at these companies, but you would have the sales team, and it was just like a black box what they did. They just like lone wolfed it. It was just like the Wild West. And you just cheered when they brought the meat. I don't know what they brought, but when they brought the sales in, everybody cheered. But it was just kind of like it was a relationship. Y'all remember these? Have you been in one of these companies? You remember them,
I think some
right?
of those still exist, but they're a lot less frequent than they were back in the Wild West days, for
Yes.
sure. Yeah.
Well, yeah, times have changed. And we somehow got these lone wolves, the black box, into a disciplined process, put so much data around what happened in sales and marketing, all of this pre-sale activity. It's kind of crazy to think about it because you're like, so many of the things that existed today, they used to not exist. It was just a different world.
Mhm.
And today, we are kind of going to be opening the box a little bit on all that rigor, all that discipline, starting a new mini series about how do we start to apply that same rigor and discipline and data and intelligence
Mhm.
post sales. Okay. We're all like, we remember the transition pre sales. What does that look like post sell? And I'd say today it's still a little bit lone wolfish, but we'll get into it. So, David, Mohan, I know this has been on both of your minds lately. And so, why don't we just kick off with some thoughts on why it's so vital to start to extend the revenue operations post sell?
Yeah. I think the journey is actually interesting because you started off with the lone wolf. And I think there's no doubt that whether it was the lone wolf or the relationship builder that was just golfing and drinking a beer with buddies to bring in the
Yeah,
sale,
that's a
right?
good one.
All of these personalities, I remember, like, I think it was around 2010, 2011 when the Challenger sale came out and started itemizing these. And I think that was right around the time we started getting more structure in sales as well, right? And the reality is that we started off with sales ops. And sales ops
Yep.
was instituted to kind of get this house in order and to start to drive pipeline scientifically, not based on gut, not based on the heroics of the lone wolf or the relationship builder, but based on what the math said: conversion rates, probabilities, clear qualification stage gates, right? And so this sales ops function was born in order to empower the uh, what we call today the CRO, but probably back then was the VP of sales, to really run a machine. And sales ops was responsible for driving the rigor, the discipline, and the data, and providing that data and providing the context to the leader so that the leader could make judgment calls based on data, can drive the accountability, can drive the rigor and the discipline, and use the data to guide the pursuit. And we saw tremendous results from that. Like, we all have seen the difference between a relationship or, lone wolf driven culture of sales versus the sales machine of today. Well, what happened was that was so powerful, people started to realize that the pipeline wasn't just guided by the lone wolf and the seller selling. It also required the same type of discipline around marketing. And okay, maybe we can't make fun of marketers as much because of the host of this podcast, but the
Yeah,
reality
that's
of
right.
they're kind of creative and a little bit loosey-goosey in their own right, right? And so we expanded sales ops to become RevOps. And RevOps is really about providing that operating infrastructure, that same thing, that rigor, that discipline, the data orientation, the context from the data to the entire pipeline. But sales and marketing is only the first part of the pipeline. And the reality is the industry is begging for us to take that same data and discipline and move it into the post-sales world. And as we have been in this space more and more, providing what we call commercial intelligence, really an understanding from the account perspective, the existing relationships we have already, which are responsible for probably about 80% of your revenue in a year. That's the wild, wild west. And we have these relationships and we think of it as a chummy world and we gut feel the red, yellow, green, how healthy it is. There's no data, there's no discipline, there's no rigor. How many customer success organizations, account management organizations, how many leadership teams have reporting around the health of their clients? How many have data around where they sit, how they drive rigor and discipline? Where's the meeting cadence for the same as the pipeline review, right? The account review. All right. We have QBRs every quarter, but they're deck after deck after deck. It's all of this stuff that's created. It's not real objective data and signaling. And I think it's time for us to call time out and say RevOps needs to expand to be commercial ops and take care of the entire revenue cycle, not just the first 20% of it that happens pre-sale.
Yeah, I see it exactly that. I mean, it's a classic tale of local optimization failure
Hmm.
where sales ops is looking at, with marketing, the sales pipeline, customer success account management is looking at renewals. At best, finance is, from a reporting perspective, pulling everything together and asking what's going on where. It's too little too late when finance is doing it. It's almost like seeing, Courtney, specialists for every symptom, but there is no real general practitioner that's bringing all together, right? I mean, that's what, to me, a RevOps function is. It's how do you systematically own the health of revenue in an organization? That's what RevOps is.
David, I will say, I think you were the first one to kind of bring this idea of commercial operations, like pulling it through the whole customer life cycle. And as soon as you brought it up, I was like, Absolutely. I would love for you two to talk a little bit about what has changed. So as much as we're like, it's gut feel, it's the reality is up until a couple of years ago, that's all you really, you didn't have a lot, that's kind of what it was.
100%. Yeah, I mean, here is the reality. When you're talking about measuring things, if you look at what actually drives net revenue retention, right? Let's decompose this from the top level. An executive cares about net revenue retention. That should be responsible for 70% of your growth every year, right? Should be coming incrementally from your client base, right? So that's the objective. Break it down. How do we drive net revenue retention? Well, it really comes down to two things. One is the retention of your accounts, and number two is the growth of those accounts. Those are the two things that matter. So if we want to start to measure those two things, we have to ask, what are the leading indicators? What are the KPIs that I would actually measure? And you have to go ask yourself the question, well, okay, what are the leading indicators? And I mean, where does revenue and growth come from? This is the hard part. There are three things, and they're all very, very nuanced. They haven't been measurable, right? It is the perception of service quality. It's not very easy to measure perception, right? It is the strength of interpersonal relationships in that B2B relationship stack, right? How easy is that to measure, right? I can measure who's connected to who, but the strength of the relationship? And then finally, it's the degree of commercial alignment, right? How well does the service provider fit in the strategy of the client? Again, hard to measure. What's new, to answer your question, is that AI, advanced analytics methods, have given us an ability to understand human language and nuance in a way that we can actually now use it to measure it, right? We can actually measure perception and strength and degree, right? Those nuanced words that are really hard, right? That's not measuring a transaction. That's measuring human nuance, human language. And so the AI now empowers us to go look at all this digital exhaust we have, right? Over 85% of an enterprise's data is in email. That's according to research a few years ago. I'll bet you now it's between email and video transcripts. How many video transcripts are sitting around untouched, right? We get them in our inbox as notes. Every now and then I go look at 1/37th of the ones that I get and do something with it. But it's sitting there, and it's all of this data that is human language we can now query, and we can actually turn that into understanding proactive signals and objective measures.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and it's crazy to think sometimes it is just the tooling that it takes to unlock. It feels so obvious. Of course, it's commercial operations. What do you two think? I think there is like a bias towards new logos. I mean, maybe it's because I'm in marketing, but I think there is across all organizations. It's like an emphasis on new revenue. And I think we are moving into a season where that has to shift. What do you two think it's going to take to really shift that? Not just, I think we're saying, and maybe if you're listening to this, you're thinking, yeah, of course it's commercial operations. Of course it should be the entire life cycle. But what is it going to take to like practically shift organizations into thinking more about retaining and growing their existing clients?
I think it's going to take a combination of somebody like a CFO and COO just kind of looking at this from a business perspective and saying, to grow the revenues, I need to have a solid foundation on top of which we'll bring in new logos. Right? If you don't have a very strong conviction about that, then you have a business where your new logo rate has to significantly outpace your churn rate, right? And that is not the way to build a sustainable business. There are some exceptions, of course, but generally speaking, when you have enterprise level, larger customers, you have to focus on retention because, it's all about feedback loops and understanding when leaders can intervene before the damage compounds. So if you don't have the rigor, you don't have the data for it, it's always you make a bet on future customers with whom you don't have current problems versus current customers with whom you have problems. So there's an automatic bias towards it, right? And just kind of taking a hard look on what it takes to build a sustainable business is the cultural shift we need. It sounds easy to say, but it's hard to do it in a world when you don't have good data around it.
Yeah, I would just add to all of that. Just there are a couple of basic things in my head that just scream to me. The first one is new logos are sexy, right? Like it is the fun, ring the bell, right? Whereas I think net revenue retention and serving your customers, by default, it feels a little bit more meat and potatoes to people. And so I think there's a disproportionate effort that goes into not only what's sexy, but it's really, really hard to go hunt and find new customers, right? And so I think that's blinded people for a while. I also think that human relationships are hard. And we had this problem with sales too for a long time. Sales wasn't run this way, right? Remember where we started, right? And so we just get blinded to the fact that human relationships are hard and these are murky. So we get lost in the difficult, right? Because all of these things, when we're talking B2B relationships, are about relationship, and humans are just difficult to manage. They're not predictable, right? And so we get drunk on the hard, right? And so because of that, sometimes we overlook simple solutions because simple is not necessarily obvious. And so just like there was a simple solution to sales and applying it to marketing, I actually think this is a simple concept and people will be like, of course, why haven't we had discipline and rigor in the same way around managing our clients? We should. That doesn't mean it was obvious before somebody tripped over it and it became a thing to talk about. So what I imagine happening is I think RevOps is going to go through another evolution. It's going to go through that next generation. We're going to go sales ops to RevOps. Just like there's a RevOps movement, you can now find communities of RevOps folks, right? It's a discipline. You have a skill, you have a craft. I think those people are going to get to that next generation. It's going to be a thing. And all of a sudden you're going to start to see this cascade because something that was kind of hidden because it was hard and it wasn't obvious, all of a sudden is obvious to people because other people are talking about it. And then the last thing I would say about simple is also not easy, right? Just because something's simple doesn't mean it's easy. If it was, everybody would be incredibly fit because getting healthy and losing weight and being in shape is actually pretty simple, right? You got to eat right and you got to exercise at least a little bit, right? But that doesn't mean it's easy, right? We have to discipline ourselves and we have to go through the hard work. And so to me, that's where this evolution of RevOps is it's starting to become obvious. We can finally measure relationships and simplify them a little bit, but simple isn't easy. And organizations are going to have to go through change management to instill the rigor and the discipline. And just like we had to take some of our most successful sellers and replace them to create a new DNA in culture, we're going to have to do the same thing with customer success and account management and even leadership, right? It's going to take a new DNA to say, no, around here, we run by the data. And just because you had a great conversation with one executive sponsor doesn't mean the fabric of that relationship is incredibly strong. Here's all the weak parts that the data says exist. Now, my job is to go attack those and strengthen them and help them to grow as opposed to just have my own talk track and bias of, oh, this is healthy. Trust me, it's good, right? And keep on chumming it up with your friend on the other side, right? That DNA, that culture change has to happen.
Well, I know two teams that will probably be the biggest cheerleaders for this change happening.
Sales and marketing?
That's sales and marketing. That's absolutely right. I mean, there's nothing like selling things into a leaky bucket. And so
Totally.
I see them being right on. Well, and they've been through this transition already, whether or not if they're thinking about it or not. Okay, so today's episode, we kind of dove into this idea of how commercial operations is shifting, how it's pulling into the whole customer life cycle, and really thinking about running revenue with intention from the beginning all the way to the end. And so the next episode in this mini series, we're going to be getting into some of the practical parts of this. And so if you're interested in kind of digging into what commercial operations practically looks like, that's what we'll be talking about in the next episode.
Super awesome, Courtney. I just wanted to preview one thing because I think this is an
Yeah.
exciting part about moving into commercial operations from revenue operations. You also, for the first time, start to get into the profit machine of the business, not just the revenue machine
point.
of the business.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of potential here, even beyond just your growth. It's also about the bottom line, which can
Yeah.
get business leaders really excited.
Yeah, for sure.
So exciting. Can't wait.
David, Mohan, thank you as always.
If today's roundtable conversation resonates with you and you're thinking about how to turn RevOps for clients from a pre-sale discipline into an always-on machine, you should join an upcoming webinar that we have on commercial operations. We'll be talking through more practical ways you can extend the discipline of RevOps through the entire customer lifecycle. You can register to join us at knownwell.com/RevOps. Dr. Vasant Dhar is a professor at NYU's Stern School of Business and the Center for Data Science, and one of the world's leading authorities on prediction, data science, and trust in AI. His new book is called Thinking with Machines: The Brave New World of AI. Dr. Dhar is also the creator and host of the Brave New World podcast and newsletter, where he interviews Nobel laureate CEOs and thought leaders about technology, ethics, and humanity. His research has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Wired, and MIT Technology Review. He sat down recently with Buer to talk about why we all need to learn to think with machines, what Roger Federer can teach us about competitive edge, and more.
Vasant, welcome to the show. We're so thrilled to have you.
Happy to be here, Pete.
Let me start by congratulating you on the publication of your book. I think maybe last summer, if I have that right, Thinking with Machines?
Actually, only November, middle of November. So
okay.
not even 2 months. It's brand spanking new.
Well, newer congratulations to you then. We're looking forward to digging into that and to hearing from you and all of your wisdom as we go. I understand from the book that you've been following AI since the 1970s, and with that as history and backdrop, what's it been like to see AI explode the way it has on the broader scene these past few years?
There's this famous Jerry Garcia line, right? What a long, strange trip it's been.
Yeah.
That's kind of the way I see it. I got into AI in 1979 as a graduate student, and I did my thesis in an area of AI called planning, which is really all about, how do you order what you're going to do and, maintain dependencies, among the things you're going to do. So that was way back. And that was my first exposure to AI in the medical arena. I was a PhD student, and this other student comes along and says, hey, there's this professor who's built this amazing medical diagnostic system over the last 10 years. I want to have him offer a course in AI. And I said, what is AI? And he said, oh, it's about getting computers to be smart. And I said, that sounds really good to me. So we went up to the medical school lab on the 13th floor. The professor was on the phone. And while we were waiting for him, there was this gigantic screen in the middle of the room and a physician with snow white hair puffing a cigar, quote unquote, talking to this system called Internist. This was 1979, right? So no PCs and Apples and any of that stuff. It was time sharing. It was connected to a computer at Stanford. And the system called Internist was really impressive. And that's how I start my book, is with that first interaction between Jack Myers, who was the expert, on whose knowledge the system had been built, and Internist.
Nice.
And what really blew my mind at one point during the interaction was the internist asked him a question, and he said, "Why are you asking me the question?" And internist said, "Because the evidence you've given me so far is consistent with the following hypotheses, and this question will help me discriminate between the top two." And I was standing there and saying, "Holy smoke, like how is a computer doing this?" And this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. So that's how I got into it. And then, I was the first AI person hired at the NYU, business school. And then I brought machine learning to Wall Street in 94 and set up my hedge fund after that. And I've been immersed in the field, now for, almost 50 years.
That is an awesome story. Thank you. You don't get too far into the book before we discover something called Dhar's Conjecture. Can you explain it to us and the story that led you to a point where you chose to declare it?
Yeah, so this is like 1992, 1993, before I went to Wall Street, and someone from Nielsen Household Services, which is a division of AC Nielsen, this media company, a gentleman called Dennis Tobolsky, you have to remember him, showed up my office and said, "Hey, I believe you're doing something in machine learning. We've got this massive data set where we track 50,000 households and everything that they purchase. Um, can you look at this data set and tell us if there's anything interesting because we sell information?" So I said, "Sure." So he gave me the data set, and I cranked my, genetic learning algorithm, and it spat out a whole bunch of stuff. And Dennis came back 2 weeks later and said, "Did you find anything?" And I said, "Yeah, but I have no idea what it means." He says, "Well, let's take it from the top." And I said, "Older women in the Northeast do a lot of shopping on Thursdays." And he looks at me and says, "Oh yeah, that's because that's coupon day. What else did you find?" And I was just like, ecstatic that I hadn't told the computer to find any such thing. I just said, find unusual consumption patterns. Um, and, and it was amazing that it actually made sense to him. Right. And as I went through the rest of the patterns I found, they all made sense. And I've encountered this phenomenon so many times. The same thing on Wall Street, where I was working with a proprietary trading group and I found that certain volatility conditions led to better performance than others. And I found the reasons for that like much later, right? And so I call it Dhar's conjecture, which is patterns emerge before reasons for them become apparent. And by the way, this is not anything particularly profound. This is how science progresses. People sort of, I mean, the DNA. How Watson and Crick sort of found the DNA. They went to this lab where there were people running experiments. They saw stuff, and they put two and two together to make five, and said, "Hey, it looks like it's a double helix." They came up with a theory after the fact. The explanation was followed, preceded by the data. So, this was my first experience that sort of led me to that. And over time, I realized that patterns emerge before reasons for them become apparent. And that's what you're really getting at, which is something I start out, relatively early in the book.
Listeners to our show will have often heard us discussing the notions of compounding intelligence and how business leaders can gain probabilistic edge with AI. And I understand Roger Federer can teach us a little something about the power of these ideas. Could you share?
Indeed, indeed. At his commencement speech at Dartmouth College a couple of years ago, Federer, told a story. He said, over the 1,526 matches I played in my career, I won 80% of them. What percentage of points do you think I won?
Hmm.
And the answer was 54%, barely better than even. And another great, Boris Becker, had barely like 52.5% win rate in terms of points, and a very high match winning percentage, like high 70s, because you won the important points like tiebreakers and stuff. But the takeaway from Federer's um, statistics was that all you need is a slight edge, and then you compound that, over, in his case, the course of a match, right? So if he's like even like slightly better than the opponent, over every point, that edge multiplies, and the longer the match, the more likely he is to win it, of course, assuming that he doesn't get exhausted. And I found the same phenomenon in finance. I view finance and sports as sort of two sides of the same coin. No one's leaving anything on the table. Highly competitive, everyone's motivated, everyone's got the best equipment, the best training, and everything. And so everyone's looking for that slight edge. And the larger takeaway from this is that a slight edge is all you need. You don't need to be perfect. You don't even need to be very good. All you need to be is slightly better than average or some benchmark, and then you let compounding,
Yeah.
do the rest for you, over time or over a large universe of things, So, in my hedge fund, for example, we have barely a 50 to 53% win rate, right? So, but over many trades, over many decisions, that edge compounds. And I sometimes tell people, if you have a 53% win rate in finance, you should be running the world's money, because unless something really bad happens, that edge just compounds like crazy. And this is true across pretty much all areas of business. You know, Even an insurance company, that's underwriting, policies. If you're just slightly better in your underwriting process and slightly better in how you assess risk, you're going to do a lot better than the competition.
How do you crosswalk that over to from that insight to how you run a business? Is it different thinking in the way that you do planning and the way that you evaluate performance?
Great question, right? So we're talking sort of, or at least we were talking sort of at a problem level, right?
Yeah.
That if you're trading, the decision is, do I make a trade? If you're underwriting, the decision is, should I underwrite this policy or not, right? So these are, decisions that you're making. But the question you're asking is broader than that,
Yes.
which is that if I'm running a business, if I'm running an insurance company, or if I'm running, a hedge fund or, an asset management company, um, it's well and good to sort of think of the edge, but it's a larger problem than that, which is how is this new technology, in this case AI, going to transform every aspect of what I do, you know? And because there are so many things that I could do, you know, what are the most important things that are going to move the needle, right?
Uh-huh.
And as a business leader, I'm concerned about ROI, right? But before you can calculate the R, you need to make some I, right? And the question is, where are you going to make that
Mm.
investment? You know, and and to me, that's like the biggest challenge for businesses. And what I tell businesses is that the problem in this case begins with the CEO. It has to. Right? It has to come from the top. This is not something you hand over to the CTO or the CFO or some team of experts. It really has to come from someone who really understands the business, really understands it well, and can take a 30,000-foot view, right, of things and say, where are we going? In which direction is this business or industry heading? And what are the kinds of bets I should be making? So it's a leadership problem first and foremost. It's not a technology problem. Like that comes down the line. So it's leadership required to identify how the industry is changing, how the technology might transform the industry and the business, and what it means to make a product, to deal with customers, to distribute it, and all of that, right? So it's a comprehensive view of
Yeah.
the business.
It feels to me like it's also a transformative input into opportunity picking, right? Like go for those places in the business where gaining just enough edge, gives you the Federer advantage, right?
Yeah, exactly. And when you think about it, there are two parts of this, right? And this is not rocket science, right? One is, what's the probability of success if I pursue this one particular area, and what's the size of the opportunity? And the product of those is your expected value, right? So you have to sort of make that assessment as to which opportunities have the largest business value and the largest probability of success, right? And find that right balance. And now you could say, well, I want to make the back office more efficient. Well, that's great, right? That's probably has a very high chance of success, but probably a low payoff,
Right.
right? So you sort of have to balance those two and assess risks versus rewards.
Yeah.
Not rocket science, but you have to think through it, right? There's no alternative.
Well, and when the opportunities for improving business processes and improving performance are so broad across the whole of the organization right now, you need to be bringing a different kind of calculus to where the returns are going to come from.
You
Um,
do, and you also need to be assessing, how many of these can I actually do, right?
yeah, right.
If there are 100 possible projects, I can't do all 100. I don't have the
Exactly.
resources, right? How do I rank them? How do I order them?
I don't know about you, but I could listen to those two talk forever. Fortunately, we're going to bring you part 2 of their interview on next week's show, so be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen or watch so you don't miss it. And thanks as always for listening and watching. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating on your podcast player of choice. Seriously, it is really helpful for other people to be able to find this show. As always, we'd also love if you would share this show. At the end of every episode, we'd like to ask one of our AI friends to weigh in on the topic at hand. So, hey, ChatGPT, how you doing? This episode, we're introducing a new mini-series on why you need to make sure RevOps extends beyond closing a deal. Any thoughts?
If RevOps only shows up at close, you're leaving growth on the table because the real leverage is in what happens next. Think end-to-end. Handoffs, data, and incentives should all be built to drive retention and expansion, not just the win.
And now, you're in the know. Thanks as always for listening. We'll see you next week with more AI applications, discussions, and experts. Hey, if you made it this far in the episode, first of all, thank you. And second, we know that AI is changing all the time, and so we've got you covered. Here is another great episode for you to watch to stay in the loop on what's happening in AI and business. And second of all, we'd love for you to subscribe. You can do that right here. I've always wanted to do that, by the way. So do that now. That would be great.